Hello, it is February, which means that it is February Fantasy Stories Month, typically focused on celebrating shorter fantasy stories. And it was created by the Bookish Bryants, and this year it is being hosted by Steve Donahue. And I realized upon the creation of this channel that I should probably participate. And I was looking around the shelves for something to talk about, and I alighted upon Jirel of Joiry, which is a book that I read fairly recently uh, upon finding out about its existence from Michael K. Vaughan, who really praised it, really loved it. And when he described the book, I got pretty excited. Jirel of Joiry is a series of short stories published in Weird Tales in about the 1930s by authoress C.L Moore, who, her pen name was C.L Moore because she wanted to sound like a man. Well, she needed to, rather, in order to be published. And these stories are some of the first fantasy stories to apparently star a strong woman, sort of a Red Sonja type of character named Jirel, who of course has red hair. And these stories are mostly focused on her magical adventures through strange magical worlds. And I was excited to read that, and luckily I found a couple copies at my amazing local used bookstore, which exists right across the street. And I bought this copy for about $5, and I got home, and naturally I didn't read it for another couple of months. But when I finally got around to reading it, I found that there were 5 stories included. Now, this character has only ever had 6 stories, but for some reason the last one, Quest of the Starstone, is not included in this paperback, so I had to read that separately, but that was okay. I don't know why it wasn't included. Maybe it's because it was the least interesting one, but I'm going to talk about all the stories now in order, give little summaries of them and my thoughts in general. Okay, so the first story is The Black God's Kiss. This story starts off with Jirel already having her lands completely dispossessed by this one man, this evil warlord that it is implied she has some kind of history or rivalry with. And she's taken prisoner, and she in her own castle, and she vows revenge. So she descends into a dark passage at the bottom of the castle into a sort of hellscape, a sort of underworld. It's implied that it might be hell, and she travels across this strange, ever shifting landscape to find a weapon suitable for taking revenge upon this man. She eventually finds that weapon in the form of a statue, a black god statue, and she is instructed to kiss the statue. And when she does, she gets a fatal kiss. When she gets back to the overworld, she gives this kiss to this man, and he falls dead. But then Jirel realizes that she might have loved him, and she falls crying at his feet. And that's the end of the story. And that was the first Jirel story ever written, and it's a strange little thing. Most of it is focused on the shifting dream imagery of this weird world, and there's some good images in there, but for me it just sort of flits in and out of things without any purpose, and it's easy to get tired of, in my opinion. The next story is The Black God's Shadow, which is a bit of a continuation of the last story, where she goes back into the underworld to find this man's soul and see if she can either bring him back to life or avenge him or something. And the Black God's shadow comes back, the shadow of this statue. It's all very vague because she doesn't understand this world. She understands it as much as the reader does. This shadow envelops her, but she resists its grasp, escapes, and she sees this man's spirit and she watches it escape. And she's satisfied that this man, that she wasn't able to bring him back to life, but she's satisfied that his spirit has passed out of hell and perhaps gone on to a better place, or maybe went to purgatory instead. And so she returns above ground, safe and sound. And this story is a lot less interesting than the first one. It has the same issue with shifting dream imagery. Jirel doesn't really do much. Like in these first two stories, which is about the first like 80 pages of this 200-ish page book, she doesn't really show her strength that well, especially not in fighting or deeds of arms. She's mostly just walking around a weird landscape and looking at things. It could just be any Lovecraft character doing this. So this story, I think, was the weaker one. Is a continuation off the first one, which sort of puts you in the perspective of C.L. Moore, who was writing these stories for Weird Tales back in the day. She wrote the first story just wanting it to be its own thing, and then she decided to write a sequel, which sort of ties into the first one. And from this point on, she's just going to write Jirel of Joiry stories, and they're all episodic. So the next story is when Jirel of Joiry really finds her footing. So you have to think about it that way when you're reading this story. This isn't one continuous novel, of course. This is a compilation of stories that were never really meant to be published together. It's like reading Prince Valiant or something. The beginning is always going to be rocky. You can't expect it to cohere very nicely. The next story is Jirel Meets Magic, and this was a pretty good one. This one started off with Jirel in the outside world, taking a wizard's castle, and I was very excited to be reading this, to be seeing Jirel actually out in the real world fighting, doing her thing. And she finds this wizard locked up in the top level of the castle, and she finds that he escaped through a magical window that leads into another land, which is a pretty cool concept. She goes through this window and finds a sort of strange fantasy world where the wizard is communicating with a witch who's has all these dryads at her command, and there's more. She's eventually enveloped by another weird soupy shadow dream, ineffable, non-Euclidean is the word that was used, essence. Non-Euclidean was a word coined by H.P. Lovecraft, who actually was a scientist, and then it was repeated by Robert E. Howard and C.L. Moore, and they had no idea what they were talking about. I don't have any idea of what non-Euclidean is either, but I can tell that it's not exactly what these people think it might mean. Basically, it just means a spirit that you can't tell what even it is. And there's a lot of that in this book. You can tell some of the writing's a little bit trashy because it uses the descriptors of hopeless hope and voiceless voice to describe these things. And I've come across the word hopeless hope before, especially in Alan Dean Foster's Star Wars novel, The Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and for me, it has become an indicator of what is trash, generally considered trash, like something for Garb August. When the phrase hopeless hope occurs, you can tell that this writer is just trying to be interesting, and that appears in here. But yeah, Jirel Meets Magic was rather interesting. The Dark Land. Now this one was my favorite story of the bunch, I think. It starts off with Jirel laying on a deathbed, and you don't know why she's dying, but she is, presumably from a wound in warfare. The priest shrives her. She suddenly disappears from her deathbed, and everybody's shocked. She's actually transported to another world, pulled there by some spirit, some god, who tells her that he has looked through the cosmos to find a woman who is as strong as she is, or as he is. And he found Jirel, the only one, and he wants to marry her. So he snatched her from her deathbed. He saved her soul from death so that he can marry her. And she doesn't want this marriage to resume. She'd rather die, which is very strong of her. And he says, all right, well, this realm is totally under my control, which it is. This world that she's in is like a small pocket dimension that encompasses only one kingdom, and all of it is under this man's control. The laws of Jirel's universe, our universe, does not apply to this one. This god is in control of everything that happens. He can change the shape of the world if he wants to. and he dares Jirel to find a way to kill him before the day is up. And she actually does find this way to kill him. She like shoots a crystal on the wall or something, and the whole world falls away, revealing that it was all just an image inside her mind, all an illusion. And now she has seen it, that it's just pitch black. She's seen it for what it truly is. And she floats in darkness for a long time, and eventually she reawakens in her bed, apparently having gone better. And this one was pretty interesting. There was less of the dream imagery from the first 2 or 3 stories, which, bringing it back to real life a little bit, I just think improves it. It just makes the adventure a bit more believable. Jirel's character is not just an observer anymore. She's actually walking around, discovering things, doing things, fighting, showing her strength, her prowess. And that's part of why people are coming to this story, these stories these days, is to see a strong female character from the 30s in a medieval fantasy setting. And the last story that is in this book, in this actual volume, is Hellsguard, which is a story about Jirel going to some castle somewhere to rescue some mercenaries that were captured from the realm of Joiry. And she comes across this castle, which is inhabited by several people, just a small band of people, and they're apparently after a treasure that was hidden in this castle long ago by one of its deceased former owners, who is now a ghost that haunts the place. But they're trying to get this ghost back, so they lured Jirel here because they think that a woman could lure the ghost. A woman. Yeah. A lot of these, a lot of stories from the olden times written by men, you will realize a lot of these old stories sort of have a weird obsession with rape. There's a huge theme is just like women being rape magnets, the near rape scene where the hero fights the villain and rescues the woman in the story, and then the story just progresses, and it doesn't add anything, and there's no interest, it doesn't open up any possibilities, and all it does is sort of degrade the female character and improve the hero. That kind of obsession is really apparent in a lot of older books. Thankfully, it's going out of style, but it's very irritating, not just on a social standpoint, but on a storytelling one. And even this story written by a woman featuring a strong female character isn't really free from it. There's still a little bit of an implication in there in certain parts, and this is also one of them. The way that the ghost lecherously is attracted to Jirel. But she resists him, of course. She doesn't want it. And she eventually figures out how to steal the treasure and escape from this castle. But she soon finds out that the treasure was the spirit of the ghost itself, I think. So she decides to come back to the castle and deposit the treasure, taking revenge on the people in the castle who took her prisoner. And this one was also pretty interesting. I think that it was my second favorite next to The Dark Land. And the last story is Quest of the Starstone, which is the one that I disliked the most. Although that could be because I had to read a badly transcribed copy of it off of archive.org on my iPhone, which wasn't very comfortable. And I don't know why it wasn't included in this version. It's not that long. It was written by the same person. It was written at the same time. It should have been under copyright, but it's not in here for some reason, which is weird because this story is the weirdest of all of them, but it's also the worst one. It features Jirel teaming up with another one of C.L Moore's characters, a science fiction ray gun wielding hero named Northwest Smith and his alien accomplice. A wizard goes into the far future to recruit Northwest Smith and his alien accomplice to come back in time to fight Jirel of Joiry so he can recover his crystal MacGuffin thing. And Jirel of Joiry and Northwest Smith have a brief fight. He shoots his ray gun a bunch, she swings her sword. They decide, eventually this man just realizes that this wizard actually doesn't care about me at all. He just wants to use me to get this crystal, and he's not even going to pay me back. So then he and Jirel team up against the wizard, and they defeat the wizard, and Northwest Smith is able to go back in time to the future, and lives comfortably at his little cyber bar up in the stars. And this is a really boring story. Aside from the weird premise, which is sci-fi and fantasy coming together in the 1930s of all times, which is sort of intriguing, this story was really boring. I would not recommend reading it. But since it was not included in this book, maybe I could still recommend this book. I think it was... You see, in my opinion, this story, as I've said, it cannot be judged as a whole, because it's not a whole. It's a compilation of stories. It's a collection. It's not even a collection of the best ones. It's pretty much all of them. Well, it is a collection of the best ones because the worst one was left out. But still, it is just a collection. So, how can I rate this book? Well, the ones that are good, and the ones that are bad. And that's basically all I have to say. When taken as a whole, though, I feel like there's so much more to Jirel's world that we haven't seen. There's so many wars that she must have taken part in, so many epic feats that she must have accomplished that are not related in these tales. Like, no doubt she has encompassed and come across all these strange fantasy lands and all these weird shifting dream imagery places in her life. But what about all the wars she's fought? What about what makes her a strong warlord of her lands, of Joiry? The lands that she owns, how did she win them? All these questions, I feel like I wish were at least answered in some capacity. I wish that there were more stories of Jirel. I find myself wanting to go back to this world and these characters, mainly because I feel like the story hasn't been finished yet. But as a relic of its time, I think it's interesting. I think it could be worth going back to. If you like these pulpy stories, I don't think it compares to Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard or other authors of the weird tales era. But for what it is, it's fairly interesting, and it is important that C.L Moore was a female author working in science fiction fantasy. She made a female character that was strong. That's important, but other than that, there isn't much to it. So that is my contribution to FFS for 2023, and I will see you later. Goodbye.